What I'm sharing today came out of my PhD research. I just finished my PhD about a month ago, thanks to a lot of support from Naomi. Thank you. So two of the theorists and people, humans, who contributed a lot to my research were, of course, Dorothy Smith, as we've been talking about, but also one of my professors at McGill, Aziz Choudhury. These are two theorists that not only are really important to my work, but also passed away while I was working on the research. So I wanted to start by acknowledging their contribution to the way that I was thinking about research. Dorothy, we've been talking a lot about this, but Dorothy, she framed research as a kind of education, and I have a background as a high school teacher, so this idea of research as education really rang true to me. She talks about research as a kind of learning with people to explain to them/ourselves the socially organized powers in which their/our lives are embedded and to which their/our activities contribute. And I think that as we were discussing this morning about trying not to objectify our research participants, trying to work with them in a participatory way, that praxis, that approach was something that really stood out to me. And although Aziz Choudhury and Dorothy Smith were very different researchers, I think Aziz really had that commitment as well. His work was always with community, and it was never about the academic productions of knowledge, but rather about how it actually made sense in activist spaces. So I wanted to just start by acknowledging that relationships are the key to education, but also I think to research, having that bold step that Dorothy finished her final book on, or Dorothy and Allison finished their final book on, about actually taking it to a place of action. Similarly, we talked this morning about how things can be performative, and I think land acknowledgements often can. I live and work in Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, and when discussing the internet, which was the focus of my research, with participants, with high school students, we focused on the material impacts of virtual processes, like how data centers and other internet infrastructures contribute to the displacement of indigenous peoples. And we also explored how the resources and energy required to run these infrastructures are still a result of ongoing colonial projects. In Quebec, where I'm living, the James Bay Hydro Project is where we get most of our electricity. And still to this day, there's lots of activists trying to stop the way that that project continues to take more land, and also the surrounding areas around the hydro project have been flooded with dangerous and poisonous sediment or dangerous poisonous minerals that have made agricultural activities in that region and other traditional indigenous approaches to life very difficult, if not impossible. I hope that this research, especially the actual participatory part when I was working with high school students, was able to help them question a bit the normalization of our ongoing roles in colonialism. And I think that's a big part of my research, is there's this common sense approach we have to using digital tools that really forgets the material impacts of them. And Dorothy's idea of taking the concept of text to try to think about what are we displacing or replacing when we talk about different things that don't seem to have humans involved, we need to always remember that there are humans involved and ecological processes, that without acknowledging that, we sort of just accept that we're doing neutral work when we're actually making a lot of people's lives really difficult. So the agenda for today, I'll start with sharing my research questions that guide this study. I'll tell you a little bit about the study, and then hopefully we'll spend more of the time looking at the theoretical and methodological resources that allowed me to do this work, and at the end we'll share a bit of the findings that I came to. One of the examiners said that she doesn't like it when PhD students don't have conclusions in their work, and she said that she appreciated that I at least ironically nodded towards the possibility of conclusion. That's a quote. So I thought I had conclusions. Apparently I didn't, but we'll see if we get there. So the research questions guiding this work. How are the internet and digital technologies organizing or coordinating students' experiences in shared or related ways? So when we think about the early work that Dorothy based IE on in the women's movement, I think that process of just getting people together to see how their understanding of something might not be this individual issue, but something that's structural or systemic, that was what I'd hoped would get what we might reveal with that first question. Then, how do students understand the interconnections between their use of the internet or digital devices and their well-being or the well-being of the planet? So when I think about critical theory, I really do think that we need to reattach that to actual emancipatory movements, because too often, especially in education, we hear people talk about critical literacy, and critical has in a lot of cases completely lost any connection to that, trying to make the world a better place. So by focusing specifically on students' well-being and then the well-being of the planet, such as social and ecological justice questions, I hope to reframe critical theory in ways that were more urgent and authentic. And then the third question, which was more what I was trying to work with the educators at the school to explore, was how might pedagogical structures or practices and the structures that mediate them, how might those influence or change students' digital engagements and dispositions? So the study I did was with 2 classes of grade 8 social studies students, about 55 students, 3 educators. And I worked with the class for 3 months. I was in the class about 4 days a week, and I facilitated lessons on 16 different periods. And then in those lessons that I was facilitating, we were working towards the creation of cell phone films where students would use their devices to explore something related to digital practices. So when you talk about critical literacy, or especially critical digital literacy, often that means something like studying a critical topic like labor exploitation by using the internet or digital tools. And I wanted to refocus that to suggest, yeah, that's important, but we actually should be looking at the critical aspects of those tools. So instead of just studying labor exploitation by using a device, it's actually what is the labor exploitation involved in the mining and manufacturing of that device, in the moderation of content, in the e-waste disposal. And so thinking about the digital tools themselves as the anchor from where we were exploring our critical, different critical topics. As you can see in the background of this study overview, these are some of the storyboards the students were creating as they prepared their cell phone film explorations or inquiries. And the topics, it was very open for them to try to figure out what they wanted to explore based on their experiences. And the topics they ended up exploring were online harassment, environmental issues, beauty standards / body image, the exploitative labor involved in industries related to tech, big tech's influence on students' choices while they're online, device overuse, and data tracking. With each of these topics, there's so many things I want to talk about, so I'm going to really try to stick to the 20-minute timeline. I'm not going to go over the data collection methods, but I just wanted to share, like, I've had recently a really big issue with this word data collection, and I realized that it frames it as this extractive relationship, which is, as i.e. participatory workers, I think we're trying to move away from this idea that we are just going in and extracting ideas from our participants. Like, the idea of working participatorily, I think the word collection actually leads us away from that. So I think that's something to be aware of as I continue. But the last piece, the arts-based digital participatory visual methodological approach that I was taking with cell phone videos, I wanted to point out that for me was not a data collection. I did not collect the videos that the students made and analyze them in some sort of abstract, individuated way, but rather that was a way for students to take their inquiries further so that they could then, in our focus groups and class discussions, explore things with me. And so to the point that Max ended with about the power asymmetry in these relationships with our participants, I think it's important to acknowledge that when we really are doing an IE with students, that might be a way to resolve that. Like, I think often we talk about IE as a participatory approach, but we don't think of it as students or our participants doing IE work. We're just working with them to do our IEs. So I think that maybe by working with a different framing of what we're doing and having the students as the leaders of their inquiries, that we can address some of those power asymmetries. But of course, as an adult, as a teacher, as a researcher coming into a space, there's always going to be those power asymmetries. So it's about trying to think about how we can frame our research to give students as much power or control. But as anyone who's worked with students knows, you need to scaffold there. You can't just be like, all right, do anything, because then students don't do anything. So some of the theoretical resources that I was drawing from, again, in terms of critical, that term critical, I have Horkheimer and Adorno there. And no, Horkheimer, is that Adorno, Max?
I don't see really well. That looks like Horkheimer.
This one's Horkheimer, I think? No. And that's Adorno? This is Horkheimer?
Okay.
Marx. That's embarrassing. I swear I studied this stuff. So Marx is the founder of critical theory, according to Horkheimer. Like the idea that Horkheimer and the Frankfurt School was working with was from Marx's ideas. So I wanted to focus on them, although I forgot who they were, because I think we really do lose touch with what critical theory is about. And I also have focused on Tara McPherson on the top right, because she was one of the first scholars I read who was actually saying that the way that we approach critical digital literacy studies can be a distraction from actually approaching things with the critical lens. She suggested that it necessarily involves more than just studying our screens and the images that dance across them. She focused instead on the devices themselves. And she actually went so far as to suggest that when we do the kind of critical digital literacy practices that just is about studying what's coming, the content on devices, we actually might obscure the relations involved in the actual owning that device, using that device, disposing of that device, all the underlying things that are involved. And here I've circled Alan Luke, who is another critical literacy scholar who I think framed what I think of as critical literacy in a way that really makes sense to how I was hoping to support students. And this was that critical literacies are about finding a way to broaden human agency and individual and collective action. There's a couple of scholars circled here, Leander and Burris, and they are more recently trying to raise the flag about how all sorts of automated processes on the internet have made it more difficult for us to open up the black box of the text and look in and figuring out what types of social relations might be involved. And they specifically look at how corporations are more and more involved in mediating our digital experiences. And in a similar way to how Shoshana Zuboff talks about surveillance capitalism, they're trying to get researchers and educators to think about how even in this landscape that is more obscured or more obfuscated, where there's more black boxes, how we can still insist on trying to recognize the humans involved and open them up even in complex digital or in complex technological landscapes. Here I've circled Ruha Benjamin, who's another scholar that really informed a lot of my work. And Ruha Benjamin's book, she talks, or this is actually not her most recent book anymore, but her book that is subtitled The New Jim Code, I forget the actual title, she talks about how tech fixes often hide, speed up, and even deepen discrimination while appearing to be neutral or benevolent. And in the work I've been doing recently with Naomi's lab, we're studying in child welfare the digital management systems involved in trying to organize the workers and the clients. And the more that I learn about that, the more that I see ways in which by using technological tools, workers treat what they're doing as if they're following objective standards, and it's harder for them to recognize when racism is involved because they're like, oh no, the tool said this. And it's like, yes, but somebody programmed an algorithm into that tool that was looking for certain things, and that programming could or is often based on historical patterns of discrimination. And then I've circled Dorothy here, and this is from the article that we'll be discussing this afternoon, Telling the Truth After Postmodernism. And I love how she challenges the post-structuralist idea that because of multiple sites of meaning that we can't find truth anymore. And she's like, no, in fact, that's actually the only way we can find truth, by looking at truths shared in common. And finally, I've focused on Bell Hooks's idea about talking back, speaking as an equal to an authority figure, because in this age of really complex technological tools that are mediating our experiences online or in real life, I think we often feel helpless and we feel like, oh, these powerful tech companies are just too complex and too powerful. And I know that Bell Hooks was writing in this quote in 1989, but I still think that we really have to, for our research to be optimistic and possibly making changes, we have to commit to this idea that even in the face of powerful structures of domination, it remains possible for each of us to define and determine alternative standards, especially when we're working in collectives. So looking a little bit at my methodological approach, Dorothy has this great quote from Text, Facts, and Femininity, where she's talking about Black and punk communities of women and how they were able to change what femininity was expected to look like in the typical fashion magazines of the time. And she writes, when the codes and images are viewed as women use, play with, break with, and oppose them, the discourse of femininity appears not as managed construct of the fashion industry, manipulating people as puppets, but as ongoing, unfolding, historically evolving social organization in which women and sometimes men are actively at work. So this idea of trying to lead young people through an institutional ethnography where they were creating cell phone films about issues that they have with their cell phones, I was hoping for students to explore the ways that they actually are negotiating these types of expectations, and then also in negotiating them, actively shaping the way that they and their peers, especially within their own classrooms, think about things like femininity. So that involved the digital piece, using cell phones. I was working in a school where all the students, it was grade 8, 55 students, they all had a smartphone. So cell phones have become something that's so central to a lot of people's experience. And of course, this wouldn't be the case in all contexts. But in cases where it is, it allows, I think, a little bit of a power, allows students to have power in a way that isn't a researcher pushing something on them, because most of the students were actually more expert at the way they were manipulating their devices than I am. I've never owned a smartphone. Humble brag. And so I think it allowed me to really let the students be experts in a way. Like, there was still a lot of times where I was feeding back information that I had been researching, but in a lot of cases, students were the ones that were telling me things that I didn't know about before. Here you have a picture of cell phones and then a bunch of e-waste. This idea of a participatory approach, there's been lots of writing since, so Jenkins in 2009 was writing about how the internet made it so much more possible for everyone to participate in discourses. And since Jenkins wrote that, a lot of people have been like, it's actually not as easy as we think. And someone who I love her approach to it is Louise Druhl. She has this critical atlas of the internet where she has all these amazing diagrams about how the internet functions. And this one is a simple one just showing how there's these slopes of a few leading players, big tech companies online, that now, unlike the GeoCities internet of the 90s, there's a lot more of the experiences we have online are mediated in ways that we have less of an exploratory thing, like we're just sort of rolling down these slopes. And so by acknowledging that, I'm not suggesting that we actually have to surrender to this challenge, but rather that we need to learn about those slopes in order to maneuver them more expertly. And then arts-based, using the cell phone films as not just like a documentary approach, but something creative. I like what Mitch, one of our colleagues, said about adding a visual or an arts-based dimension to an IE project reflects IE's goal of uncovering knowledge to be usable in the way that a map can be used to find one's way. And this idea of knowledge being usable, if I were to have given my dissertation to all the students, grade 8 students I was working with, I don't know that many of them would have read it or been interested in it. But by creating these cell phone films that they all then watched in a vernissage kind of like showcase activity, they actually became very engaged and started having conversations that hopefully we'll be able to describe a little bit in when I get to findings, although probably we'll run out of time. But this quote from Sullivan, I think, really also captures this idea of why arts-based approaches might be meaningful in trying to affect change instead of just reach conscientiousization, like instead of just consciousness lifting, also trying to encourage change. Sullivan writes that arts-based approaches, that the aesthetic vision engages a sensitivity to suggestion, to pattern, to that which is beneath the surface as well as to the surface itself. And I think that really beautifully captures this idea of not just thinking about the content, but also the whole context of that content in terms of the formal factors. So a little bit of my findings. The first slide of findings here is about the idea of digital tools as texts. And this afternoon, I think we're going to be hearing from Mr. Hastings, Colin, about this idea a little bit. I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but last night we were chatting a little bit about how Dorothy Smith uses this idea of text to refer to anything that can coordinate action across different contexts. And Colin was reminding me that sometimes these days the term text isn't that helpful because there's so many different things that aren't really conventionally texts that are involved in that coordination. So in my research, I hadn't yet talked to Colin about this, so I just went with it and used the word text, but I actually use it to refer often to cell phones. And there is precedent. There's a guy who Naomi went to school with named Michael Corman, who in research on paramedics' use of technology talks about technology as the text. But I agree with Colin that maybe it's time we move on from that word. So when I was talking with students about the idea of digital tools as texts, we started talking about all the different people involved in their coordination with those texts. And I really wanted to get to this third point with them. Like, that was what I was so excited to talk about, like surveillance capitalism and all the unintentional, or not unintentional, but hidden things that are coordinating their online experiences. And we did get there with some of the groups, but students were much more interested in talking about the way that parents or their teachers in school were coordinating their digital experiences. And with parents, one of the big findings was just that, I don't know if you have the similar experience, but so many of the students I talked to felt they had a lot of struggles trying to manage their digital device use in real time. But when they provided themselves with some sort of a proactive boundary, like leaving their phone in another room, having one of those time limit apps that parents often set up. These types of approaches were much more effective, and the students who had relationships with their parents where their parents weren't forcing those types of solutions on them, but just sharing those strategies and allowing students or young people to choose how they wanted to regulate, those were the students who seemed like they had a really healthy relationship with those tools. However, when it came to how educators were influencing those relationships, nobody seemed to have a very healthy relationship. There was this sense at the school since COVID lockdowns that if you were sick from a day of school, you were supposed to Zoom into class. And the teacher I was working most closely with, he was very not okay with that. So he was telling students, no, like if you're sick, try to relax, sleep, drink a bunch of water, like get better. But he would actually have students who would, because he wasn't setting up a Zoom for them, they would like WhatsApp into or FaceTime into a friend's phone and try to like be in his class, because there's this expectation that if everyone else is able to participate, then if I don't, then I'm going to miss out on something. Or like this idea of keeping up with the Joneses has become much more exhausting in a world without snow days, without sick days, where we can always participate remotely. And I actually, not surprisingly, got COVID while I was working at the high school. And I think, no, it wasn't Naomi, I think someone else was like, well, have you thought about trying to just continue your fieldwork remotely? And I was like, yes, I thought about that and decided not to. Because I think that one of the big impacts of digital tools, and this has come up this morning in terms of the value of getting us together for 2 days of thinking, is that we are so, there's so much information out there that it feels like we need to constantly be gathering citations and reading the newest thing, and we don't have that time for the slow processes of deliberation, the quiet processes of deliberation that Max brought up earlier. I'll leave that part there. Have I been 20 minutes? Probably. Okay, well, I'm almost done. So the other way that I was thinking about findings was looking at the content of digital tools, so specifically the videos that students were making. And one of them that I'll bring up was about that really fit with the types of readings I was doing from Dorothy, had to do with the way that women, a lot of young women, feel that they're expected to perform femininity based on what they see on TikTok. A lot of the young women who were involved in my research were very active on TikTok, which is a short form video application. And there was a sense that, some of the young women felt stronger about it than others, but there was a sense that the way that they see other people acting dictates what was normal for how they expect themselves to act. And that had to do with things like how they dressed, but also things like vaping. Like these are 13-year-olds, and the idea that vaping was very normal was something that I think for a lot of them was something they learned from social media. And so by taking the time to create these alternative sort of cell phone films where students got to choose their own understanding of, or dictate at least a bit more of their own understanding of what it meant to look like, to be a woman, to explore being a teenager, it allowed them to push back a little bit on those narratives. And it was very powerful to hear how affirming it was for some of these young people to have an alternative to go to. Because although I'm not trying to suggest that there's anything necessarily wrong about dressing different ways or experiencing femininity in ways that have historically been critiqued, I think it is important that that's not the only option for young people, that they have alternative experiences that aren't just dictated by the social media they're engaging with. Looking specifically at arts-based or digital inquiry, there was a sense from a lot of these young people that when they experience something through TikTok or through a short-form video, it's a lot easier for them to engage with it. And I know that as I was a high school English teacher, so someone who loves reading and loves long-form texts, it was the conservative part of me was a little bit uncomfortable with this idea that young people were just so much more willing to engage with short-form video. But I think as teachers, as researchers, it's important to, especially as participatory IE researchers, to meet our participants where they're at. And if that's how they're making and creating meaning, then that's where we have to turn our attention. Second last slide. One of the students I was working with who chose the pseudonym Hugh, he sent me an email. He was one of the ones who was coming to like all the focus groups and all the everything. And he sent me an email at the end of, towards the end of my time with the students asking if he could do another meeting. So I set up this one-on-one meeting with him. And this was back when crypto was and NFTs were all like everyone was talking about. And he wanted to talk to me about how he's trying to invest in NFTs, but his dad won't let him take any money and blah, blah, blah. And so we had this talk about it, and I tried to caution him a little bit about the hype aspect. And at the end of the day, I went home, and my partner said to me, like, oh, how was that meeting? Because I told him I was meeting with this student. And I was like, it was fine, but like I don't think I learned anything that I'm going to include in my research. And my partner said, did Hugh learn anything? I was like, oh yeah, I think he took a lot from it. And my partner looked at me and he was like, wait, I'm so confused. Like, isn't your research about supporting them? And I'm like, oh yeah, that's what I'm doing. And I think that's why I started with this problem with data collection. And that's why I think we need to rethink that term, because even though I'm like so committed to participatory work that centers the young people that I was working with, I still was like, oh, this day of research wasn't valuable because I didn't collect any data. And it's like, of course, I collected data, but not in the way that we would conventionally think of extractive positivist data collection. So in conclusion, I love this quote from Dorothy and Allison's final book. It's about the idea of texts. And it says, IE uses the concept of text to draw the researcher's attention to material media that carry messages, images, and sounds using technologies that displace the presence of whoever made them. Recognizing these ethnographically, that is, as they actually enter into actively coordinating people's doings, has proven essential to developing ethnographies of institutional and organizing relations. So I think with my focus on digital tools, one of my main goals was to try to recognize the displaced subjects that are actually involved in these texts. And so that's this idea from Colin of trying to move away from texts. That actually might be helpful for that goal of trying to recognize the humans involved. And I think especially today with the AI buzz and with everyone getting really excited about automated processes, it's more difficult and more important to try to trace out some of the actual humans involved in coordinating our digital experiences. So do humans ever escape from the internet? It's not likely, not anytime soon. So hopefully we can engage with it and figure out how to maneuver it more responsibly. Thank you so much.